Hello students and welcome to today's class. Today we are going to discuss the political system in the Bronze Age civilizations. We have started with the Mesopotamian civilization, and in this political history of the Mesopotamian civilization, today's lecture will be focusing on state structure in ancient Mesopotamia. There are certain objectives of the topic. For example, we will be looking at the development of the institution of sacral kingship in ancient Mesopotamia. Various forms of taxations will be also looked at. Then we will be talking about the Mesopotamian justice, law and punishments. And lastly, we will also focus on the foreign relations Mesopotamia shared with the other contemporary. Now first, talking about the institution of sacral kingship. People perform rituals to purify either themselves or a particular place, to predict what will happen, to appease a divine being, or to create wealth. When a person moves from one stage of their social life to another, for instance, from the daughter of a house to the wife of someone in another place, a ritual is performed to mark the transition. In most simple societies, where people have many roles, it is important to know how to act properly in order to be in charge. Although a tribal chief eats the same food and uses the same tools as his subjects, symbolism and social etiquettes are essential to assert that he is the leader, spokesman and the performer of the ancestral rites. Thus, it becomes essential to invent new social etiquette for the maintenance of social and political order. During the Mesopotamian times, when we talk about the political history, kings also had a small amount of force they could use to force people to do what they wanted. But they did not have much pride in owning land or irrigation water. The greater the potential for conflict in their societies, the more they vested their office in their mystical values that placed them above criticism, which ultimately avoided revolting tendencies in their subjects. As far as the political system of ancient Mesopotamia is concerned, the Uruk expansion involved not just the inserting of a Mesopotamian method of sealing and recording in settlements at a distance, but also the architectural characteristics of Mesopotamian religious buildings. Indeed, in Bronze Age Mesopotamia, there are many rebellions, wars of succession and assassinations of the rulers. This paradox puts the issue of sacral kingship in perspective. As noted by the eminent anthropologist Webster, theocracy never meant that the ancient king was solely a cult figure or that the polity was entirely religious, and as a result, sacral kingship rendered physical supremacy and warfare obsolete. The author insisted that we do not allow ceremonial facade to cover the accurate content of kingship, or worse, think that religion was the source of royal power. Power, of course, came from the command over the labor of others, from military might and the ability to enforce, though in a limited way, the obedience of others. The prominent mythic document that sheds light, though indirectly, on the Mesopotamian institution of kingship is a Sumerian epic tale about the hero Bilgames, a tale called Bilgames and Agga, or it is also known as the envoys of Agga. Now, according to this story, Agga, which was the ruler of Kish city, sent a request to the city of Uruk demanding its submission. But its ruler Bilgames turned to his city's council of elders for advice, and they recommended accommodating to Kish's demands. Despite his dissatisfaction, Bilgames decided to take the matter one stride further and turn to the city's popular assembly composed of all men of fighting age. Now, refusing the idea of surrender, the community urged armed resistance, exactly the answer Bilgames had been waiting to hear. Bilgamus was thoroughly supported by his people in this battle, which resulted in the defeat of the enemy camp. Now, as the story goes on, the will of Uruk's council of elders was not binding upon its kings, who were in reality free to turn to the popular assembly and even ask for its opinion. There is less information available as to whether the assembly's expressed will was then obligatory or again merely just an advisory. The mythic account often describes the religious affair and the human affair as well. It also speaks about a governmental structure that included an absolute ruler on the one hand and a legislative body on the other. In practice, the legislature consisted of a smaller council and a large assembly. Such structural elements comprise what Thorkild Jacobsen termed a primitive democracy that existed in ancient Mesopotamia some 4,000 years or so. Undoubtedly, the sort of government attributed to heaven may have been a divine version of the kind of government the Mesopotamians were by this time familiar with on this planet. In envisioning the world of the gods, humans often want to project images from their own earthly experience onto a larger heavenly screen. In such a way, the gods of mythology can take on human characteristics in their physical appearance and sensitive makeup. It is noted that kingship descended from heaven, first before the well-known Great Flood of the city of Eridu, and then later after the Great Flood to the city of Kish. So proclaims the Sumerian king list, a text that purports to list the names of all of Sumer's emperors from the dawn of civilization. It further implies that certain emperors, including those of Eridu and Kish, once exercised their sovereignty over the entire region. Every city-state, the city and the cultivated fields surrounding and supporting it also needed to be administered on behalf of its native god. For this cause, there also had to be a native government also. In the beginning, the sacred and secular authority may have rested in the hands of one individual, a natural enough development since the people of Mesopotamia saw no contradiction between the two. Thus, the earliest ruler of a city-state may have been the En, which means a Sumerian word for the high priest. The high priest would have thus been the local god's representative on earth, handling the temple lands and the people. The Sumerian phrases also depict the king as the lord of all lands. This in turn helps them accept the king's sovereignty all over the Sumer region. At a later stage, when the population had grown and society had become more intricate, a second agency may have arisen, that of a governor, whose duty is to manage civic affairs, for example, law and order, commerce and trade, and military matters. While the high priests continue to manage the business of the temple, which means the supervision of temple lands and the performance of religious rituals. During the crisis, a Lugal, which means a great man, was appointed by the people through a council or a popular assembly. Indeed, the office of great man seems to have emerged at about the same time as Sumerian cities began to construct defensive walls to protect themselves from the enemy and thus needed leaders in times of exceptional emergency. Initially, the great man might have been assigned authority only during an emergency, but if the crisis persisted or repeated itself, the great man's supreme authority may have become permanent, specifically if, like Marduk, he enjoyed power and exercised it with vitality. The individual city-state merged into alliances or was occupied by its neighbors. The high priest or great man of the dominant city might hold a broader sway and govern like a king. However, to validate this greater power, the king would require a divine mandate, particularly since he was no longer just the leader of a single community but the master of a broader domain. One solution would be to claim that he had been chosen by heaven, which could be acknowledged by the high priest of a nationally venerated temple, such as the temple of the god Enlil at Nippur. Indeed, the king's success is evident as well as the most conclusive proof of his divine choice. Now, along with this success, his choice by the gods would be celebrated in poetry and songs as well. Although the kings of Mesopotamia sought divine approval, but they did not necessarily regard themselves as divine. In inscriptions, only some kings' names were prefixed with the sign Dengir, which meant a god. Sargon of Akkad's grandson, whose name was Naram Sin, was the first to use the honorific title, as Naram Sin's sculpted stela of victory depicts him as superhuman in size. The Sumerian proverb puts it as follows, in inverted commas, man is the shadow of God and king is God's reflection. Although royal dynasties flourished, the direct descent was not a requirement for the succession of a ruler. However, a king might be succeeded by a brother or by a son other than his firstborn. The symbols of kingship in Mesopotamia consisted of the crown, the throne, and the sceptre. Each of these had a ceremonial function when a new king was installed, just as such objects have played a role in the institution of kingship in every region. The duties of the Mesopotamian king were also corresponding to the responsibilities of other kings. He participated in religious rituals, directed the administration of justice, and managed the affairs of the state in times of peace and war. In carrying out these responsibilities, he acted as the earthly representative of the gods and, in precise, the chief god of his city-state, manifesting in the performance of the royal virtues of strength and wisdom. Several officials assisted the king in the exercise of his powers and carrying day-to-day administration. Mention may be made of the priestly hierarchy of temples, including the high priest of state's principal god, a judiciary to administer the laws, a commander-in-chief of the army and his subordinates. Besides a vital person to tender advice and conduct the business of diplomacy, the palace also needed a large staff to maintain the day-to-day operations of the palace, a ready corps of scribes and the occasional architect or sculptor to execute commissions with the aid of their trainees. Once the territory of the kingdom grew, especially when it achieved the size of an empire, the king needed governors, likely drawn from the nobility, to administer its parts, as well as a cadre of royal messengers to transmit reports and deliver his guidelines. This institution was filled by the substitute king. Now, the custom of this substitute king was one of the strangest Mesopotamian royal duties. If dire omens predicted the king's death, a temporary substitute would be chosen among the royal class. The substitute is to be dressed in royal robes, he is again to be given a coin, and he is also allowed to live in the palace in the belief that destiny will strike him rather than the real king. After the danger was averted, the substitute went to his fate, an expression that implied death. In this manner, the Mesopotamians hoped to trick fate. Making of substitute king was not precisely a career move unless you were dying to sit on the throne. Now, talking about the taxation system in ancient Mesopotamia, nominally the flora and fauna of a Mesopotamian city-state belonged to gods and were managed by their substitutes, the rulers and the priestess. Individuals who used these items and gained economic benefit from them were subject to a variety of taxes. In the absence of coinage, people were allowed to pay taxes in the form of goods and services, and generally the goods represented a share of what had been produced, for example grain, dates, fish, wool or livestock, or a percentage of its worth in silver as well. Services could be provided through military service or by laboring on communal projects like the excavation and maintenance of irrigation canals, the harvesting of crops grown on communal land, or the construction of temples and palaces, etc. Merchants were also subject to special taxes when they shipped or received goods or passed through seas along trade routes or crossed the rivers. With the progression of cities and the rise of empires, tax collection became a significant government activity, employing forces of civil servants, some of whom frequently traveled to make collections. Those who declined to comply were threatened with military reprisal. Mesopotamian kings often sold the right to collect taxes to the highest private bidder, who then gained a fortune by extorting a far more significant sum from the taxpayers than he had paid. A king will almost never grant tax exemption to a favorite in exchange for past or future service. As the ancient proverb record, the Mesopotamian people mostly feared the tax collector. Now, talking about the justice, law and punishment systems which were prevalent in the ancient Mesopotamia. The Mesopotamian people believed in divine power as a force that brought order from chaos. The maintenance of universal order was the topmost responsibility of heaven's Suvan, the sky god who was known as Anu. In this belief system, the king was the representative of Anu on earth. His main job was to make God's will happen on earth by bringing order to people's lives. All of this can be done if the government is fair, makes decrees, passes laws and makes sure they are followed properly. Finally, the divine mandate implicit in a Mesopotamian king's action improved his authority and inspired compliance. It is no coincidence that kings in practice stressed that they were acting solely on behalf of the god. Their divine status, when assumed, only served to strengthen the spiritual mandate. And despite the presence of primitive democracy, it was not a legislature but a king who enacted and implemented the laws and regulations. Punishments could be severe, and severe is powerful deterrents against unlawful acts. Formerly Sumerian law seems to have been guided by the principle of compensation for a victim who had suffered injury or loss. Still, the later laws preferred to physically punish the perpetrator, following the principle of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a principle which is enunciated in the Old Testament as well. However, initially such a practice might seem barbaric, but once closely introspected, it can be regarded as an attempt by a society to set limits to retribution that might otherwise have taken both the eyes and even the life of a criminal. For instance, the death penalty is advocated for breaking, stealing or receiving stolen property. It is also followed for falsely accusing another person of murder. An adulterous couple was bound and thrown into the river to drown, and a son who struck his father had his hand cut off. Also, a priestess who was caught while entering a bar was also burnt alive. For the understanding of Mesopotamian legal system, there are a number of court records which survived. Some cases acquired such notoriety or seemed so stereotypical that they became copying exercises for scribal trainees and thus were preserved in multiple copies as well. Wealth, control of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers for transportation and farming, boundary disputes and the need to get luxury goods like wood, stone, and metals often led to war. The city walls firstly may have been built to protect livestock from wild animals and poachers. Some early walls did not encircle the city entirely and were perhaps used as barriers against flooding. The walls, once instituted, displayed the wealth and power of the ruler, and sometimes they were richly decorated. The people of the ancient Near East elucidated warfare as the goddess will. Early dynastic monuments also illustrated battles fought and armies conscripted. The texts from the early military dynastic period described recurrent armed conflicts within Sumer and against external invaders as well. The other documents recorded lists of those working in the military, chariots and weapons section. The first perfect reference to a standing army, however, came from the Akkadian dynasty. King Sargon, who ruled from 2334 up to 2279, spoke of about 5,400 soldiers eating before him. There were many consequences of war. Once the war ended, cities, houses and individuals were looted thoroughly. In the local battles in Sumer and Akkad, the city temples were treated with respect since they worship gods of the same pantheon. Conversely, booty was grabbed from the temples of enemies. The kings of Akkad presented the smallest token gifts to the gods from their plunder. Stone bowls inscribed with booty of Elam or booty of Magan have been found at numerous sites. One of the most valued spoils of battle was the people. From the Ur third period onwards, few tablets documented long lists of women and children. Males were not included in these lists, perhaps because they were often killed, tortured or mutilated. Sometimes captured soldiers were sacrificed to the gods. Official propaganda from the 3rd millennium BCE said that empires' bodies should be piled up and buried in large mounds. This would make sure that their ghosts would haunt the descendants of those who killed them. Women and children were sometimes killed in the general massacre, but most of the time they were taken as slaves. Other deaths were also attributed indirectly to warfare. Those who escaped from their conquerors often died of exposure, famine or thirst as well. Those besieged within their stays also grieved from starvation and disease. They sometimes ate the women and children, but cannibalism was not frequently practiced. Prisoners of war were often taken to long marches. The prisoners were often naked with their hands bound behind their backs and sometimes were entangled in a net. Meanwhile, heavy chains were expensive and thus the prisoners were often blinded. When brought to their captors' land, they could still perform many tasks such as carrying water from a well or canal with a bucket and a rope. At the end of a battle, prisoners were then transported to the victor's land. Several prisoners were incarcerated and used as bargaining chips in political negotiations. Supplementary prisoners were held hostage for a ransom, some becoming laborers in a house of bound men for a limited time though. Such practices were confirmed by ration lists and death certificates of the prisoners of war. At this time, the deportation of citizens became an issue. Now, after the treaty, the two parties swore an oath and performed rituals for peace. For instance, at Mari, the ritual was to kill asses as part of the ceremony. In peace treaties, both parties swore by the gods to obey the treaty terms as well. If one side attacked the other, the gods punished the offending party. The prospective agreements included these clauses, thereby endorsing future cooperation rather than settling past differences. A letter to a god at Mari traced a broken deal to the alliance between earlier kings. The writer stressed that breaking an oath was considered a religious sin. Parties to the treaty agreed to support their allies militarily. The treaties also included repatriation clauses. In his letter to the Goths, Sarhedon wanted the extradition of his brothers who had murdered his father. Before the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, international alliances were formalized by different treaties. Now, coming to the last part of this lecture, we will be talking about the foreign relations that Mesopotamian rulers had maintained during the contemporary times. The political map replicated a lively diplomatic scene. Messengers travelled widely both within and beyond the borders. There were some spoken messages also, but rulers mostly used a lot of written documents to control their officials and talk to their allies as well. Because of written correspondence, ambassadors could represent their rulers in making treaties. Nonetheless, high-level meetings still took place between rulers. For instance, the king of Ugarit, which was the port city in Syria, he visited the palace at Mari, and Zimri-Lim himself went on a diplomatic mission to the Mediterranean. The crossing of frontiers must have required cautious planning. Kings probably travelled with an entourage, some of whom were armed. Kings also sent ambassadors on special occasions or as residents at other courts to establish and retain diplomatic relations. They commonly brought a gift of great rarity or high quality craftsmanship. The exchanging of gifts was one part of the reciprocal relationship between the king and his visitor. Particular gifts were requested, but sometimes the recipient criticized a gift. Dynastic marriages were also a feature of foreign relations, used to cement ties between ruling families almost everywhere. The king served any number of visitors from outside at royal expense. Sometimes they were accommodated in the palace also. The Mari archives documented the daily royal menu on the thousands of tablets. In addition, there were banquets for exceptional events such as religious festivals and visits by foreign ambassadors. Seldom had we found a mention of more distinguished guests, such as the Hurrian ruler of Nineveh and his entourage of more than 1,000 followers. Ambassadors, they enjoyed certain diplomatic immunities also. Their property was protected and they were sometimes exempted from the custom duties. If their activities made them unwelcome, they were removed with the consent of their ruling king. Nonetheless, without the ambassadors' popularity, they were personified without hesitation. Mostly ambassadors at foreign courts have to conduct negotiations on behalf of their king, but knowing that he might come under pressure to compromise, the king sometimes gave them detailed written instructions for their talks. Generally, ambassadors returned home soon after completing specific negotiations, but sometimes the foreign ruler might detain them for several years because of difficulties between the two kings. Diplomatic protocol required an ambassador to return with an extensive gift from the alien king. Sometimes the ambassador was hindered because the alien king was unable or unwilling to send a lavish gift. Returning an ambassador without any gift was synonymous with breaking off diplomatic relations. Strangers and subjects brought gifts to the king when they were allowed to see him. This was because the king was not easy for everyone to see because he had to follow certain rules. Usually, the superintendent of the palace only had direct access to the king. The crown prince could have an audience with the king when the astrological omens were fortunate. Courtiers regularly received gifts to speak to the king on behalf of suppliants. Incorporation resulted from immigration, deportation, and mixed marriages by the people, such as merchants or long-time residents abroad. Prisoners of war were repeatedly resettled in the land of the victorious king. There was relatively little prejudice against them, and through time, they or their descendants could acquire full rights of citizens and even rise to the positions of reputation. So, students, this is all what we have to study on the political system of ancient Mesopotamia. I hope you have enjoyed the session. Thank you so much.